We're delighted to have Mario with us. Mario Solis Garcia. He was here a couple of years ago, and he talked on a completely different subject. What did you talk about?
It was news shocks.
Oh, right. That was very,
shocks.
very interesting. And he's in the economics department at McAllister College, and we were just talking earlier about what a fine college that is and how many professional, I guess maybe I know how many professional political science that come out of the political science department, and it's pretty clear that it's happening in the economics department too, because the co-author of the paper that's being discussed here today was an undergraduate at Mac and is now doing a PhD at the University of Wisconsin at Madison. Mario is interested in a broad range of subjects, including macroeconomics, growth and development, financial economics, a lot having to do with the interaction between public policy and the private sector in development and just in general in polities around the world. His first degree was from Monterey in 1997. He was at the Colegio, subsequently got his MA from the Colegio de Mexico in 2001. Then he came to Minnesota, got his MA from the economics department, followed by his PhD, and then he went over to Mac and he's been here. Okay, great. So welcome, Mario. Would you like to be interrupted, or do you just with questions? Or do you...
So, as you have questions, feel free to interrupt. I have a nice set of interactive things we can do at the very end, but thank you for having me here. As Bob mentioned, this is a joint paper with Tom Shiesh, who was my student at McAllister. Now she's working on her PhD at Wisconsin-Madison. She's also going to be an economist. I'm happy to say she already passed her prelims, so she's officially almost a candidate. So the topic of this paper is, that's a long title, but we have to call it in some particular way. Well, what we want to do here is find a way to measure something that by definition is very hard to measure or impossible to do, which is the shallow economy. So basically, why do we care about the shallow economy? Maybe it's something that developing countries are really, as a day-to-day thing, developed countries not a lot, but for example, it's easy to say, as a standardized fact, developing countries, a large portion of the economic activity goes underground. And I will be very precise about what underground means and what do we mean by shallow economy. But just to give you an idea, according to some data that was calculated by Frere, Schneider, and others in the 2010 paper, if we take the size of the shallow economy and divide it by the size of the measured formal economy, Bolivia, 63% of formal output goes on in the shallow economy, Panama 60%, Peru 58%. So as you can see, this is a sizable measure. There are some fine prints associated to this particular value or this methodology, but still, the fact is, in several developing countries, this is a very large fraction of economic activity. Now, by construction, it goes underground. It's very hard to measure because these guys, either they're too small to actually want to go and declare, or they're trying to hide from the tax sector. So that's the difficult thing. It's very hard to measure this because by definition these guys want to hide. So that's why we want to focus on it. But like, what motivates our paper? So we believe that there are two main problems with the literature. First of all, the measurement techniques that are out there right now are very ad hoc. What it means? Basically, very stylized, very depending on a lot of very sketchy assumptions. So it becomes hard to say that these things can be generalized over a large sample of countries, or you could say that basically if you start poking around it, you can start getting holes immediately and the thing just doesn't work. The second thing is, even if we assume that these measurement techniques are good, we can still have a problem for when we want to think about long horizons. If I'm a macroeconomist, so basically I need data. The more data I have, the better, but all these measures that are out there, at best, we're talking about 7, 8 years of data, maybe just 1 or 2 every 10 or 15 years. So if you want to analyze the dynamics of the shadow economy, and you want to think about what can we do about it, if there's anything we can do about it, or we want to do about it, then the measures that we have right now are just not going to cut it. So this is why we want to have a contribution to the literature. So what we do in the paper is basically take economic theory very seriously and say, okay, we're going to use the standard methodology that's used in economics, a representative agent model, and then basically this comes from economic theory. This is what you basically learn in a PhD. So if you have a problem with this one, then you have a problem with your methodology, but it's basically common ground for everything that is done in economics. We make it work with minimal data requirements. So that's really, we don't have to go and look for a very specialized data series. Nope, it's everything that you can get from the Penn World tables. That's good enough to get our model to run. Basically, a side effect of this is that we don't have any ad hoc assumptions. We're going to be very clear and transparent on how we model the shadow economy. And the beautiful thing from a computational, I'm a computational guy, 250 lines in MATLAB give you the results. That's it. So it's not something you need a supercomputer. It's just very simple in terms of data, in terms of the input that you need. So that's basically what we do. So what I'm going to do in this presentation, for time purposes, I'm going to focus on a group of 3 developing economies from Latin America. Why? Because they're nice, and also from Latin America, so I can talk a little bit more about those. But as a bonus, at the very end, if we have time, I have the results for all the economies that we have worked out so far. We have 19 of them. So if anyone picks you fancy, then we can look at it, talk about it, and we'll see what comes. So that's what we're going to do today. So the roadmap for this presentation, we're going to start briefly talking about the literature. I'm going to try to convince you that what's out there is a good first step, but it's really not going to cut it for what we need. Talk about the assumptions, describe the model economy, give you a set of theoretical results, which are basically the foundation of everything that we do, and then tell you how those theoretical results convert into actual numbers that we can take to the data, and talk briefly about conclusions and next steps. So that's what we have for today. So first of all, it's always convenient to start by defining what the shadow economy is. So I'm going to go to the experts, the OECD, and they define the shadow economy as these 5 items: underground production, illegal production, informal sector production, household production, self-consumption, statistical underground. Underground production is basically what you think about businesses that try to evade paying taxes or complying with regulations, so they do everything underground. So those are part of the shadow economy. The illegal production, name says it all, selling drugs, prostitution, etc. Informal sector production, these are productive units that are very small or that have a very small number of workers, so that either by ignorance or by lack of desire, they just don't participate in national accounts. And it's very hard to measure them, but still, in developing countries, these are a large portion of activity. This is, again, self-explanatory. This is stuff that's made in-house for self-consumption, and this is kind of like, well, the statistical discrepancy that always works. So, for the purpose of this analysis, we're going to exclude everything that's in red. So,
is household production just goods that are produced, or would that include services?
Goods and services that are produced for house consumption. So you can think of the dinners at home, or the value of the house cleaning services that the husband does, etc. Those are what's going to be added here. But since this is basically statistical discrepancy, this shouldn't be counted for market purposes. This, well, these guys are going to be really trying hard not to be counted in. So we're going to keep these 2. And this is going to come from the basic measure that we use to pinpoint what the shallow economy size is.
Keynes has this anecdote about the guy who married his housekeeper and lowered the gross national product.
Exactly. So we're going to take that out. But so if you want to think about what I'm talking about here, is just large or medium-sized firms that are underground because they don't want to pay taxes, and smaller units that are not registered or do not want to register because of their size or because they're just, you know, the guy that's selling tacos in Mexico City on the street, he doesn't need to be registered, he
So,
doesn't
so
care.
a subsistence farm is also excluded.
Yes, exactly. Okay,
Do we know anything about what proportion of the shadow economy, on average, right, across countries, obviously it's gonna vary a lot, is constituted by each of those categories?
there is.
How much of the shadow economy are we talking about? Is this just like half of it?
Yes, I don't have the number right now with me. I know that there are a couple of reports in the OECD, a 2002 one and a 2014 one, where they give some description of, for several countries, they give the values for each of these categories. Now, the OECD they strongly support the notion of going into direct methods, which are basically surveys.
Right.
So you go, you make surveys, and then that's what they advocate. The problem, as you can tell, and this is exactly what I'm going to do next, is it's really expensive to go and survey the entire country or just make a representative survey that gives you a nice idea of the size of the shadow economy. And second, there's always the problem of getting biased results because maybe it's not in your best interest to tell, yes, I'm evading taxes. So there's always this component of bias, and again, given the price, it's very hard to get data series that are long. And so you're going to have, say, an observation for 2013 in Bulgaria and maybe one in 2001. So it's going to be very hard to get a nice feel of how the cycle or the behavior over time of the shadow economy. So this is basically what's out there in terms of measuring the shadow economy. So the methodologies that are out there, direct approaches, exactly what the OECD suggests. There's also what Schneider and company call indirect approaches, and these are the sketchy ways of measuring the shadow economy I talked about. One is measuring the demand of currency based on the assumption that all the shadow economy transactions are made with cash. And so you make some heroic assumptions about the velocity of money in a given year, and then you assume the velocity keeps constant over time, and that's how you get the numbers. But then again, it's really sketchy. Another one is physical input, basically says, well, the shadow economy uses electricity, so in order to produce, we're just going to see how electricity moves over time, and if there's a spike, it means the shadow economy has gone up. So again, it's a good try, but it doesn't cut it for thinking about getting to uncover what we want to measure. The final approach is kind of more modern. It's called the model approach. So the main item here is what's called MIMIC. It's a model developed by Schneider. It stands for multiple inputs, multiple causes. And the idea is that it's kind of like a 2SLS regression. You have a bunch of causes of the shadow economy, high taxes, high regulation, etc. And then you assume that there are a lot of outcomes coming from the shadow economy, the employment rate, GDP on the informal sector. So you basically combine those two factors and infer a size of the shadow economy. So this is, I would say, it's the standard for getting the value of the shadow economy. In his 2010 paper, Schneider has a nice panel of, I think, 165 countries for like 7 or 8 years. And as far as I know, that's like what most everyone uses, just because of the breadth in terms of the countries and the time horizon, which is 7 or 8 years. So then again, how much do you want to have confidence in this model? Well, it's very ad hoc. So we say, okay, it's a good approach, but we want to do something better. So what we're going to do here is go into the economics toolkit and try a general equilibrium approach. So basically this is something that's grounded in theory. And there are 2 papers that I want to mention because they're closest to ours. First one is this from Elgin and Ustinali. Incidentally, Elgin was my classmate in the PhD, so he also knows the area.
Where is he now?
He is at Boğaziçi University in Turkey. So they have this paper which uses pan-world table data to get a super large panel, same 165 countries, but basically they start in 1950, go all the way to 2010. So they got a lot of attention because they were giving numbers that are shallow economy values for a long period of time, but we show in the paper that the results are biased in a way that I'm going to describe next. But still, that's a good improvement that they have. The second one is Orsi, Rai, and Torino 2014. It's close to what we do because they also use a general equilibrium method to back out the size of the shallow economy in Italy. Our contribution relative to these guys is say, okay, we're going to take trends seriously. We're going to introduce a larger variety of trends, and I'm going to be very explicit in what I mean by this. And we're going to go beyond Italy. So their methodology, they only have one country a long period of time. We're going to have a methodology that's useful for all the countries you can think about, as long as you want, given that you have the data, which, as I said, is...
And are these two papers related then? I mean, do they draw from?
Basically, their idea is Elgin and graph Schneider, and they expand on their time series. So they use one value from Schneider, they graph 2007 and say, well, I'm going to take this value as a benchmark and I'm going to extend using, or basically calculating a growth rate for the shallow sector productivity, which is similar to what we're going to do here. But in their paper, they basically pick some arbitrary growth for the shallow economy productivity. They say it's half of the growth in capital, half of the growth in formal productivity, and that's how fast the shallow economy grows. The question is why half, right? Why not 25, 75? Or what about the population growth, or what about some other trends? So what we do here is we are very explicit about the trends and calculate the equilibrium growth rate that the shallow economy must have if the other variables are growing at the rates that we observe. So that simplifies the problem a lot, because we're saying if the real world behaves like this, then it must be that the shallow economy, it has to behave like this, otherwise we're not in equilibrium. So this simplifies a lot of the algebra, and we can show that their growth rates are not really precise. These guys, they are similar again, because they talk about trends, but they only have one trend. We have four, so it's basically we have a lot more action coming from those things. But then again, we believe that they're sufficiently different, and we add a lot more to the literature that, well, they're closest to us, but we think a little bit more. Okay, so that's what I want to say about the literature. So I'm jumping to assumptions. There are two main assumptions that we're gonna basically take over the paper. First one is that we're gonna assume the shallow sector exists because there are very scarce or very little formal sector opportunities. So basically, you go and work for the shallow. You will go and work in the shallow sector because you can't find a job in the formal economy. So for a developed country, that's really not much of a problem, because if I'm unemployed, I go and collect unemployment insurance, end of the day. But countries like Mexico, Venezuela, if you're not hired by the formal economy, guess what? You have to eat because you don't have any sort of unemployment insurance. So it's either you're here or you are here, there is no middle ground. So, as I said, the absence of a safety net in developing countries may strengthen this effect because people have to eat. And an implication is that this need not work well for countries where the shallow economy is active because they want to evade taxes and regulations. And the stylized example is Italy. There's a sizable shallow economy, but this is because those guys don't want to pay taxes. So for Italy, maybe our model is not going to work as well, but that's what we're trying to demonstrate here. The second assumption is that trends matter. So this is what I was talking before. We're going to add 4 trends. Formal productivity, shallow productivity, an investment productivity shock makes investment more productive, and hours worked. So the first 3 are very standard in the economics literature. They won't really say a lot, but I've had a couple of eyebrows raised on this one when I'm presenting them to economists, like, why are hours worked trending? Because typically in all the models, we assume that hours per capita are stable. So you take a developed country like the US, that's really true, but not necessarily. Especially in developing economies, there have been a lot of demographical shifts that, a lot of women are going into the labor force. Hours per capita will go up. Or basically there's a big recession that puts a lot of people into the labor force that before they weren't working. That's also going to be important. So here's a little graph for you. So here I'm plotting on the y-axis an index of hours worked per capita. I normalized it to 100 in 1980. On the x-axis I have data from 1980 to 2015. And so I want you to look first at the green line. This is Brazil. So it's not really stable, but you can see that it's basically going through an average of 105 over the last 35 years. Now look at Mexico. Yep. So it's got a growing, stationary, growing again. So if we just write a model where this trend is not there, I'm going to attribute this dynamic to something else. So that's another thing, that a main difference with the Italian paper. They only look at formal productivity, how it evolves over time. We're opening and especially looking at this trend effect that is important, maybe not for Italy, but for a lot of developing countries it is. So now let's get to the ugly part. I'm going to jump through this, but this is, as I said, this is a very standard macro model. All that you want to know, especially if economics is not your strength, this is a representative agent model. Consumer and producer maximizes utility, subject to a law of accumulation of capital, subject to a restriction that the worker can work for the formal sector or the informal sector, the shadow economy, sorry, and what he eats plus what he invests better be equal to what you get from the formal output minus what the government takes away plus what you get from this is shadow output, which is basically what you produce overall. So things in red, these gammas are the trends that I'm talking about. So the hours trend is going to affect how much hours affect your utility. This is the investment shock, formal productivity, and shallow productivity. So that's the model. I'm not going to say a lot more. I'm going to add the government because it has been shown that taxes really are a determinant of the size of the shallow economy. So I'm going to add a government sector that taxes the representative consumer. I'm going to assume that G is wasteful and is funded with tax revenue. I'm going to assume a balanced budget rule so that whatever the government spends in every year is exactly what the tax revenue that they get. This is a simplifying assumption, but it makes it easy for us to determine the size of the tax rate in equilibrium.
Okay, and I see now your earlier assumption, because I didn't read the paper carefully. You've assumed that the level of government activity is independent of the size of the shadow economy.
Yes.
So that's the way you get away from the Italian dynamic.
Exactly. And also another simplifying assumption, I don't think this hurts our results a lot, is that we assume that the government cannot tax the shadow output. So in some cases, you can think of audits or a giant sweep over this place where a lot of shadow producers are. They could get hit with taxes and surtaxes. But then our problem is, how do we figure out this value of surtaxes or audit probabilities for every country, for every year? I don't think it matters a lot, but for simplicity, we're going to assume that it's just 0 and go from there. So, as I said, the set of trends is trends on hours worked, investment productivity, formal productivity, and shallow productivity. What I think is the key contribution of our paper is that we are able to show that productivity of the shallow economy is a function of all the other trends. And this is exactly what I was saying. If we believe the economy behaves like we believe it does, then there is a clear restriction on the size of the shallow economy. It cannot just move as it wishes. It has to obey some restrictions that come from how these other three trends are moving over time. And so that's really convenient for us because, as I mentioned, this allows us to back out the size of the shallow economy and how it moves over time, which is something that basically is the key to everything. So just some notation. We're going to talk about growth rates. This is just the ratio of the trends. So whenever you see a G, it's 1 plus the growth rate for that year. And then what we do, derive set of equilibrium conditions as usual. Nothing, I'm not going to bug you with that. The only thing I'm going to need for later is this condition, this equilibrium condition for shallow labor, which basically says, if you remember your micro, marginal product of shallow labor should be equal to the marginal product of the formal labor, meaning that in equilibrium, if they are to coexist, they better give you the same marginal product. So that comes from the equilibrium part. Once we have all the equilibrium conditions, we calculate the growth paths imposed by the model. And there's a lot of algebra that comes. It's really not good for anything but to prove the following results. And this is the first proposition and the first part of the theoretical results. And this says, in English, that how fast the capital stock grows, how fast hours work grow, how fast output grows, and how fast the shallow productivity grows are a function of growth rates of hours, investment, formal TFP, or productivity, and parameters. And also this thing in red, which is the shallow productivity. It's a function of things that we can measure, hours, investment productivity, formal productivity, parameters, and this parameter that's coming from the production function of the shallow economy. And you say, well, okay, but how are we going to get these three? Hours, investment, formal productivity. We have our second proposition. Let's assume that we have data for capital, for formal hours worked, and for formal output. This is the stuff that's measured. Then I can back out the three growth rates that I need using real world data via this map. So give me capital, give me formal hours worked, give me formal output, I can get the other growth rates, and I'm done. Because I have everything. So now the last part is thinking about the parameters. I'm just going to play along with the theory. These two parameters are standard literature. This eta is, again, just so that you can see it, this eta is this parameter here. It's basically saying how responsive is shallow output to hours worked and the productivity trend. That's the key thing. That's, again, since this part is non-observable, identifying this parameter here is also going to be a big problem. But what we do is we play along. So we say, okay, we're going to take the value for a shallow formal output ratio from Schneider. This is because we have to start somewhere. So basically I'm going to take a base year. Right, say 2007, the ratio of shallow to formal output for Mexico is 33%. I'm going to call it YSF. So by construction, this 33% is the ratio of shallow output to formal output. Now, that means that I can get the shallow output in levels as a product of the 33% times whatever formal GDP is. Now I have a number for shallow output. Now I'm going to do the same thing again, but remember, this was shallow output. But now I'm going to decompose it as the trend, the productivity times hours worked. Here's the eta. So I have this number, solve for NS, hours worked in the shallow sector are equal to this mess. So basically this is the 33%, the shallow to formal output over productivity raised to the 1 over 8. First result, remark, this is really interesting. If our model is true, then there are increasing returns to scale in the shallow economy. This is the implication of the model. So from here, this thing is a number that's considerably larger than 1. This is output formal, millions, billions, trillions, dollars. This is a number between 0 and 1. So this is bigger than 1. So if we want this to not explode, it better be the case that eta is larger than 1.
Do you give an intuitive explanation of how that's likely?
Well, the intuitive explanation that we have is,
I mean, just the basic claim that that they're increasing returns to scale.
Well, that comes from the math. Now, why
Yeah,
do we,
no, but I mean.
intuitively,
Yeah.
what we believe is they are increasing returns to scale at that level, but they are not able to exploit it as much because of the restrictions to financing that they face. So, think about the guy that's selling tacos in Mexico City. Maybe, let's assume that he has increasing returns. If he wants to expand, can he? Nope. If he wants to expand not even add more, what's the word in English? Add more locales, more
Diverse, or, yeah.
like Subway when you have
But
franchises.
Are they both internal and external economies, or just internally? I mean, I mean, the math says one thing, but what do you think is going on? It sounds to me like they're internal economies of scale, that is, internal to the firm.
Mhm.
Is that it?
Yes. Remember, given the way we're modeling this is just a representative consumer,
Mhm.
has a backyard technology
Mhm.
where he puts some stuff in, gets some stuff out, but that particular technology has increasing returns.
Right.
So it should be internal to that technology.
Right.
So,
So the intuition is that there is increasing returns to scale, but it's not actually realized, or it's not often realized in real life because of exogenous limitations,
most likely because
but it's in the math.
it's in the, yeah, exactly.
But it doesn't actually happen in real life because of these exogenous.
Well, does it happen? Doesn't it happen? All the numbers I'm going to show you next will have, we're going to find eta via a fixed point procedure, but basically we only allow values between 1 and 2. We're completely excluding decreasing returns. So it works, we get something that seems very reasonable. And this is shocking because most of the literature in the regarding the shadow economy believes that you have decreasing returns. It's a very low productive sector, has decreasing returns. We say no. If the real world behaves like we believe it does, it must be the case that you have increasing returns. But we're still, it's not every day that you find an increasing return to scale production somewhere, so we're still getting our heads around it. But at least I'll try to convince you that this is not a fluke, it's something that makes sense. So, okay. Bottom line, I do some more calculations, I get to this equation. It's ugly, I know, but there is one beautiful thing about it. It's one function and one variable. Eta, 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 eta. I know what alpha is, I put the
All
parameter.
the other values.
Taxes come from the data. This is why I needed the balanced budget assumption. YF, this is a number from the data, formal output. This is the shadow to formal ratio, 32%. This is shadow hours, which I got from the previous equation. This is the productivity, which I can get from the second proposition that I showed you. I know the growth rate, therefore I know the trend. So, it's very ugly, but it's one equation in data, I can solve it. So what I do is a fixed point procedure, and I'm basically gonna start plugging values, eta and eta here, until I find one where the right hand side is equal to the left hand side. That's it. So, that's what we show. Now, that was the theory. Now let's get to me trying to convince you that this works as advertised. So, the issue is that what this methodology will give you are the dynamics. It will tell you how it moves over time, but the only thing that it cannot do is say, oh, in 2010, the shadow economy was 10% of Mexico's formal GDP. It cannot do that. So we need a lever to pull and push the world out. So without loss to generality, just because it's one of the most known results, we're going to take the value from Schneider. I know it has a lot of issues, especially the OECD dislikes it, but basically, give me any number, you can use it and run the methodology.
Can you review briefly, I've read this years ago, this, what Schneider's methodology is, how does he do it?
It's a mimic. He uses the mimic method.
Oh, the mimic, that would be huge.
Yes. Exactly. So, again, there's a lot of bad things written about it. by the OECD, but since it's the most used one, and it really doesn't matter in the sense that we're only picking the starting value. It doesn't affect how the trend is going to move. Then, for the time being, we take it.
But
as a
why
starting point.
2007?
Because that's 2007, because these guys, my Turkish friends, they do the same thing. They take
Why do they do
2007 as the base year. So now you're going to see Schneider and Company, the long series from Elgin and Stonali, they hit 2007, and our methodology is going to also hit in 2007. So it's very easy to see how the three are converging to the same value. So
But what's going on in 2007 that makes it theoretically a good base year to choose?
any good year is as good as any other, because what our model is selling is just the dynamics. The dynamics are going to be the same. It's just give me a year and I'm going to expand from there. So you're going to see here. So this is the first graph that I'm going to show you today. It's Mexico, a country that I like a lot, maybe because I'm from there. But there's a lot of stuff here, so allow me to explain. In the y-axis, we have the percent of formal output that is accounted by the shadow economy. So anything between 16% and 34% of the formal output. Years 1980 to 2015. In blue, it's our measure. Surprisingly, it looks like the hours one, but I'm going to show you that's not necessarily the case. In green, you have the Schneider data, and in red, you have the Elgin and the Stonali data. So, what can you see there? This one was the first one that I actually crunched out, and this just struck me as, yes, it makes a lot of sense. Why? This is basically the lost decade in Mexico. 1980 to 1990. You see the size of the shadow economy creeping up. Creeping up. This is the tequila crisis. Shrinks. Starts to creep up until 97, which is basically when everyone agrees that the economy is stabilized, and then flat. Up a little spike here at the onset of the Great Recession. This, I'm going to explain it in a second, and then it starts to go up again. So if you think about it in terms of what's actually happened in the Mexican economy, this seems very reasonable. What the problem is with these guys is, don't necessarily look at the level, but look at the dynamics. They're saying that nothing happened in the last decade. At all. They're saying, yeah, in 1990 there's a blip. Tequila crisis, nothing happened here. It's kind of weird. And then it starts to go down. Schneider, well, you can see it's more or less within the same range. You can maybe say it's kind of steady, but not much.
But so why are they starting with such a higher percentage in those early? Can we expect that
So
prior to the
they
formalization of the economy that it would actually be higher?
remember, they do exactly the same that we do. So what we do is, this is 2007. This is the base point. And then our methodology says, okay, if this is 2007, the trends that we calculate say that this must be the case, and this must be the case.
Right, but I'm thinking about Mexico in the 1980s, right?
Mm-hmm.
Why would I expect there to be such a low percentage of formal output in the economy derived from the informal or the shadow economy? But because, so you're starting at around a 16%
Yes.
baseline, right? Or
Mhm.
starting point.
Yeah.
Why would I expect in the 1980s in Mexico when the economy hasn't like fully formalized, right? Why would I expect so much of output or so little of output to come from the shadow economy in the 1980s?
Well,
Why don't you explain the vertical axis?
no. So
Okay, maybe I'm misreading.
no. So what the vertical axis is saying is, I think you were right. In 1980, 16% in 1980, the shallow economy accounted for 16% of the value of the formal output or measured output. So what this suggests, or the way I would read this, start in 1980, the shallow economy is relatively small.
It's teeny, yeah.
Yeah, it's like Vietnam, basically. Things start to go crazy. The recession hits. 80s, last decade, starts to creep up. Creep up, creep up, creep up. And then here, stabilizes. Now remember, we are not pinpointing this value.
Right.
We're saying, in 2007, all we know is that the shallow economy was 29% of GDP. That's all we know. That's all we use from the data. And then everything else is just our implied equilibrium growth rates. So maybe this will help. So this graph shows you an index for formal and shallow output, normalized to 100 in 1980. So this is just saying, relative to the value they had in 1980, how have they evolved over time? So now you can see, well, the formal output, which is in blue, relative to 1980, right now it's 30% bigger. And basically, here's the last decade. 15 years, nothing happened. You were actually worse. What happened here? Well, ups and downs, but then suddenly it starts to go up and up and up and up and up. Right now it's 2.6 times as large as it was at the beginning.
Much more intuitive.
Well,
Visually.
no, that's
Yeah.
perfectly fine. That's why we want to do both, because in this graph you don't know really if this fall is because maybe the shallow economy is contracted, or maybe both contracted, but one had more fall than others.
So you said the Elgin
Yeah.
article assumed 50.
Yeah.
So
50%.
you did something, what did you do differently that led to these results?
Well, it's basically the growth rate of shallow productivity is a very nonlinear function of the trends on hours worked, investment, formal productivity, and parameter values. And in turn, H, A, and A, these three growth rates are again a nonlinear function of things that we see in the data. So hours is half of formal output, half of hours worked. Here's capital. So just look at these things. And I can tell you, swear, this is very ugly as well. So the probability that this function is half of capital.
So you have data points for each of those years
Yes,
on those that you
exactly.
feed into it then.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yes.
Rango, could you go back to that last slide again? Because, I mean, you know, most people would just look at that and say, this is your numbers, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Look at what's happened since 2010. I mean, well, from anything, I mean, it makes the shadow output very large.
Compared with what it was in.
Compared to what it was in 1980. So now we can say in 1980 it was 16% off.
Right, and it's the same. It's the same. It's still. I'm with Cosette. I think it's astounding.
So is it the formal productivity that's causing that change? Is that, or the hours?
Right here, I would say the driving force is the hours, but also the other three growth rates are what are driving the results. Now, as is well known, Mexican productivity in the formal sector is flat. So, as I showed you in the very first graph, hours have a strong pull. And one of the properties that we have is that in any equilibrium, hours work need to move together in the shallow and the formal economy. Again, this is the assumption. If there is a big recession out there, you can't find a job in the formal sector, then you must find a job in the shallow economy. So that's why this has the shape that seems very similar to the hours, but it's not a one-to-one copy. So this is how Mexico looks. Now allow me to present to you Argentina. Same thing, percentage of formal output, in the y-axis, hours, blue line, our numbers, red line, Elgin, green line, Schneider. So what our results suggest is they start around 18%, relatively flat. These are relatively good years. Tequila crisis, boom. Come back, 2002 recession. And then starts to pick up. And then more or less stable. Then you would say, well, wait a minute. Isn't it the case that the shallow economy must go up as with Schneider? Right? It's an escape valve. Supposedly, if the economy is doing bad, maybe you expect to see more people hanging out in the shallow economy. Well, our results show that, remember, this is a great, it's in Hassan Hall, Tim Kehoe would call this a Great Depression of the 20th century. So this is, think about this, relative to peak, this is 110, you lost about 20 or 30% of your formal GDP. Shallow fell a lot more. So everything is going downhill here. The depression is so large that even if you're in the shallow sector, you're still doing bad. Now, one thing that's really interesting is that when you hit the trough, look at the speed at which the shallow economy recovers. This one is, yeah, okay, we're moving here, but this one is, just comparing these two, I think that's really impressive. And again, the only thing that we're using here from the data is this point. Everything else comes from our growth rates. Just to, also in something that I forgot in the other slide, for 2007, we calculate some values. The productivity parameter for the shallow economy, 1.4, increasing returns. Our results imply that in a given year, people work 746 hours in the formal economy and 392 in the shallow economy. Formal output for this year, this is what we measure, $17,000. Shallow economy, almost $4,000. And again, those numbers are for that country. And then finally, Venezuela. So again, what happens here? This is somewhere where the crisis, this is, oh, you know how Venezuela dropped in the 2000s. Look at this huge increase in shallow economy size. Makes a lot of sense. So if you think about correlations, Elliot and us are going like this. You would say it was maybe spurious. But look at what Schneider is saying. Schneider is saying, no, it's going down. We're saying, no, it's going up. And if you look at the Zyram, the same thing. The recession hits hard, but then what's the speed at which the shallow economy recovers?
So do you have a sort of, I guess like if the micro foundation is an argument for why we might see the shadow economy rebound so quickly after a depression faster than the formal economy? How am I supposed to think about why that happens?
Well, that
aside
is,
from that it comes from the data.
yes, and that's our big limitation right now. That ideally we want to have a story.
Yeah.
That's okay. So this is what happens to the data. This is what our methodology pulls out. But again, our methodology is just a black box.
Yeah.
It really doesn't have a micro story. So we're trying to connect the facts. At this stage, we're just saying we know something really bad happened here. And this is reflected with the data. And basically, at this point, our way of saying we think this is correct is, again, the only thing we're grabbing is this. Everything else comes from our model. So this number would be somewhere different if we had picked this. Well, no, I guess it would be the same place. But basically, this is just one point. So
well, you know that employers are typically hesitant to employ people. So, I mean, it may very well be that the demand is being satisfied by the shadow economy. I mean,
Yes.
you know.
exactly. But
But
that's
you had a special story for that one Argentine downturn, didn't you?
yeah. That was This was when the Corralitos started and everything just imploded in Argentina. So if you think about, for example, what I could say, if you think that everyone in the economy doesn't have cash because by law you cannot get more than $10 out. It doesn't matter whether you're working on the formal or the shallow. No one's going to buy your tacos in the street. Why? No money. So our model is silent about why this catches up faster. We can start to get some feel to look at what happened in the real world and say, why might this make sense? But right now all we have is, this is what the model says, given the data. Ideally, what we want to do is, like, why not make a case study for each country? Like, this is what the model implies. Doesn't make sense, given what we know about that country. But one thing that we for sure know is that, given what you have right now, the green line, or the red line, or what the OECD has, which is just 1 point here, oop, you cannot say. So what we are providing to the literature is just saying, hey, look at the blue line. It has 65 years of data. At least it's coming from an economic model. If you don't like the assumption of no taxes on the shallow economy, well, we can change it. Give me a number. If you don't like the assumption of this other trend or this production function, we can change it. Because it's all within the same framework of a general equilibrium model. Which is not something that you do with the mimic, where, okay, put another variable in the inputs, maybe you get a different number, but why one and not the other?
So
Okay.
from a political science perspective, I mean, I have nothing to back this up, no case studies to back this up, but one could think that following, at the pit of a recession, right? The height of a recession, the pit of a recession, whatever the phrasing is. As a government, right? Because governments enact regulations that can both sort of try to control and regulate and damp down the informal economy, the shadow economy, as well as regulations that facilitate a turn to the shadow economy. We could imagine that, at that period in time, just wanting sort of consumers to have greater disposable income, they might enact regulations that actually facilitate a turn to an expansion of the shadow economy, which is why you might see the growth rate so much
Yes,
faster.
that's a possibility.
Yeah, I have nothing to back that up, but
That makes two of us. But it's reasonable to
sense,
think
right?
that the policies that get enacted will certainly have an effect.
Yeah.
Here, the main driver, or the main thing that the government is doing, is the taxes.
Yeah.
And again, in order to minimize the data requirements, we're saying every year each government has a balanced budget. Does that hold in data? Not necessarily. But it's a palatable assumption. The other one would be to say, okay, let's get data for each country in terms of the tax rates. And maybe you say, well, I want to distinguish between capital taxes, labor income taxes. That's some extension that you can do. But here, I don't think it will make a lot of qualitative difference, because again, you have an equilibrium model and you have all the margins well identified.
Right, no, I'm not saying to include it in the model.
Oh, no,
I'm saying as the why, right? It's just trying to explain it.
Right, I mean, it's a fascinating idea that you could actually get some very smart students to bear down and look at the detailed institutional histories.
So is there much data or any data on what industries these shadow activities are?
Yes, that's a very good question. The OECD and those reports that I was mentioning earlier, they have in their direct surveys, they look at industry level details, and they find that, for example, retail is one where there is a lot of participation in the shadow economy. What else? Like
Some
mechanical,
services, fixing
repair
cars or
shops,
something.
fixing cars. There are some others like construction where most of it is, where the size of the shadow economy is very small. So they do have those detailed data. So if you want to dig in, like say, okay, let's distinguish between sectors. Let's start doing a more, what's this Tim Giho used to do applied general equilibrium. So you distinguish by different industries, and then, well, maybe construction doesn't really have a big shadow economy, so let's leave it as it is. And then let's pinpoint the sizes for one given year, for a given industry, and let's see how it evolves using this methodology. Then again, is it doable? Yes, but you need an army of RAs, so,
Yeah.
and data. But it would be an extension to the model that I think would be very easy to obtain.
Just thinking about this.
So, just to conclude, and then we can leave room for questions and for playing with the data. What we did here was to present a methodology that measures the shadow economy with minimal data requirements. As I said, everything you need to replicate these figures comes from the Penworth table. One thing is that our analysis is positive, 100%. It's not normative. We're not trying to say this is the size it should be. We're just saying this is the size it is, given theory. And by construction, the dynamics of the shallow economy are a consequence of how the formal economy is doing. If it's going good, the shallow economy is doing relatively well. If it's doing bad, then they're all doing bad, depending on the size of the shock that you receive. Now the big question, and Bob warned me to have an answer for this, like how can we control the shallow sector? Sadly, that's beyond the scope of this particular paper. Again, we're doing a positive analysis. We don't have any say of what it ought to be, and even worse, how we can get it there, because this is not really what we do. That said, some question that we can answer with the data is one that we're working right now. This is a side paper. Are developing economies really more volatile than developed ones, once you consider the contribution of the shallow economy? So there's a stylized fact that says that developing economies are more volatile than developed ones. So will it still hold if you include shallow output? Right? Because the thing that you are calculating the volatility right now is just what you measure in the data. It's not doesn't include the contribution of shallow economy. So will that change the answer? And this is something we're working right now. With the long data series, we can ask what the classics by Friedman, Johnson, Kaufman, Soil, Lobaton have done. Like, what are the determinants of the shallow economy? So just throw a big, large panel, throw a bunch of regressions, law and order, tax rates, corruption, etc. See what we can get out of it. That would be something interesting that can be done, given that we have a long time series. And finally, of course, well, how can we control the shallow sector? That'll be a nice question to answer. So that's all I have for now.
You're going to show us the other ones that you.
Oh yeah, but right now,
Oh, that's.
here it is.
Oh, okay.
Those are the ones I have. So now let's play
Let's
along.
see.
Let's play along.
Chile. Let's see.
Chile. Okay, the first world of the third world.
Right.
So this is what I have for Chile. So Chile
That looks familiar.
had a rough time in the 80s. Remember, they were just coming out of the Pinochet shock and the let's not care about the bank deposits. But now, so 1990, very stable. Some ups and downs related to the copper price, I presume. And then just here, blip of the Great Recession. That's it.
United States.
United States. So we go back. This is what we have. Easy. Now here, it may look kind of weird, but look at the scale. From here, 10 to 6 is really super small. But what does it tell you? Well, you have marginal increase of 1 percentage point, marginal decrease, marginal decrease, and then a blip on the Great Recession. If you want to see the other graph, this is the universal beauty of US GDP growing at,
So it's about the same.
exactly. So this is what you measure in the data. This is the Great Recession, and it starts to catch up. If you see here, yeah, the fall is greater, and then it starts to catch up as you are recovering. So any story about the United States should consider the role of unemployment insurance. Just something that you don't have in any other developing country, and would attenuate the size of the shallow economy in the bad times. Still, we think that this is sort of interesting, makes sense.
How many high-income countries did you have in your list? I didn't
Well,
see.
let's see, I can show you Japan.
Canada,
Yeah, I'd like to see Italy at some point, even though I know the dynamic is meant to be different.
Well, there's Italy. Now, the nice,
You know
remember,
what the main components of the informal sector is?
it's underground. There's not a lot of people selling trinkets on the street, there's more firms that decide to evade taxes.
Okay,
But now look at Italy.
regular industrial activity that just manages to escape.
Yes.
Okay.
Now look at here in Italy, you say, wait, why is this falling? Well, it's falling because those are the pigs, right? And they had a bad time during the Great Recession.
Mhm.
So, starting here, everything was fine, Great Recession hits, people start worrying. Well, now, the thing is, the shadow economy falls faster than the formal economy. I don't have a story for that, but that's what the data is saying. So if you take the model seriously, that's what it says.
And what is the size of the shadow economy in
It's
Italy? the output?
24%, roughly. So here, 27.
Yes. Okay.
That's come from Schneider. Yeah.
What was your criteria in determining those countries that you are?
To be honest, the main criterion was, do we have the data that we need?
Okay, because I don't see, maybe my site is not good, but I see Asia, I see
Asia, Latin
North
America, Europe.
not one
The big
Africa.
problem with most developing countries is we need to have data for hours worked in the formal sector year by year.
Yeah.
So, at least from the data sources that I was able to get my hands on, that excludes many small countries in the Caribbean, excludes some countries in Asia, and it basically wipes out most of Africa. Why? There is no data. So then, I cannot run it, even though the requirements are really simple. I have no data, I really can't pull a lot. Some other area that has that problem too is the former Soviet bloc. There is nothing there, so.
So we collect our employment data in the US from unemployment insurance, where we survey basically all employers, and then also household surveys. Does it vary in other countries? I mean, if they don't have an unemployment, I mean, is it by survey or? how do
It would
they
be by
come?
survey. I know, for example, for Mexico, they have something similar. They go to a sample of manufacturing firms, and then they use it to infer the general change in the manufacturing employment. There is some survey that gets done at the national level, but I believe that's annual. And since we don't really have unemployment insurance, that, you know, that level of disaggregation, that frequency, we just don't see it. But again, potentially, if we have data for labor coming from whatever source, then you could run this thing. Sir?
Yeah, so initially at the beginning of the presentation, you mentioned that there are different areas where the shadow economy comes from. And you did say that the analysis included only production from underground, this thing, and then and the informal sector.
Yes.
So what percentage of the other part is being included in your study? And when I look at the, the spike in, how this thing grows, the shadow output grows after a recession, I kind of wonder if, for example, things like illegal activities are included in that, because that, after a recession, my anticipation is that a lot of people might be involved in a lot of illegal, drugs and stuff like that to recover. And also the household production and consumption, which you said is excluded. I was also assuming that that could increase the shadow output after a recession, because people will revert back to their agricultural activities and but those are not included in your model.
So in model-wise, they're not included because what we are identifying as the shallow economy is just this, as I said, this backyard technology that you only need to put labor in and it gives you stuff.
Right.
Right? If you want to take it one step ahead, remember we're using the value for, let me get Japan just because. This value over here comes from Schneider.
Okay.
And Schneider is very explicit in saying we are not including illegal, statistical underground, home
Right.
production.
Mm.
So we're only saying, well, this is what we think model-wise. Our shadow component is this backyard thing,
Mhm.
and we're gonna say the size of this backyard thing in this year is exactly that number. So I agree. It would be interesting to see the dynamics of home production and the dynamics of illegal production,
Mhm.
but the biggest problem would be getting data.
Yeah.
Because how do you measure home production and the value of that? Right? Or even worse, yeah, drug trafficking. How big is that? I don't think they want to let you know. Or it's like the classic, I have to kill you if I told you so. So yeah, that's the big problem that I think. But certainly there is that component that should play a big role in, like, even for developed countries, like there's a recession, you don't go out, you eat at home.
I want to hear your comments on, I don't know if you have any kind of idea on whether, I mean, how we could measure household production, like on paid labor, because that is a huge part of developing countries' contribution, and it all comes from, you know, women. It's not being valued, it's not being considered. I don't know, what can we do to kind of consider that in our...
If my memory serves well, there is this paper by Ingram, Kocher-Lakota, and someone else whose name is escaping me. They wrote this paper in the 90s, and they did use a methodology that's similar to this, and I have to say that it's part of the inspiration of what we do here. It's like saying, okay, let's think about home production seriously. Let's think about the way that home production takes place in an economy, and let's use real world data to back the size of it. So one thing that I remember they find out is that, at least for developing countries, home production seems to be flat over the cycle.
Mm.
So you would expect that in bad times, home production would go up, good times it would go down, because you know you want to go outside. But apparently found it's an acyclical variable, so it doesn't really move over the cycle. Then again, we're talking about developing economies.
Mhm.
Don't really think that would hold for that holds for developed economies. I don't think that would hold for developed. Yes,
But you don't know.
I don't know. Yes, that's my hunch.
What would you tell a bright sophomore at Macalester who asks you, why do you want to know this? Why do you want to know the formal economy size and exclude the informal? Now you get a case for practical answer, but from an overall theoretical point of view, you do want to know about the economy, all of it.
Mm-hmm.
And if a big chunk of it is excluded because for practical difficulties, you're still going to get an incomplete picture, and that incomplete picture is going to vary in percentage terms from the most underdeveloped countries to the most developed, and it's also going to vary depending on the circumstances of the economy. As you just said, you know, tough times, you eat at home, you don't eat out. As Bob pointed out earlier, you know, you marry your housekeeper, and all of a sudden GDP takes a hit. There's a larger question here about what are we really trying to figure out, and why are we trying to figure it out?
It's a really good question. So I would say to that sophomore is, well, you want to understand the shallow economy as a whole, because even though it's not a problem in this country, it is the day-to-day reality in a lot of developing countries. And I would say if you're from the US, you probably don't know this, but if you're from Turkey, or if you're from, you know, Argentina, you know this very well. Now, what would I say to the second part? Like, why are you excluding home production? Well, the easy answer is that it's damn hard to measure.
That's the easy answer.
The second one would be, we have to start somewhere.
That's the variation on the first.
There's a variation of the first, yeah.
It's a good one.
But basically, it's this story about that Ed Prescott used to say, that in the end, this is like, can theory keep up to measurement? If we have the right values, the right measurements for the key components to the model, yeah, I can back it up. But it's like, give me one place to pull the lever, and then I'm gonna be able to do whatever you say. But if I don't have it, that's the main difficulty, I think, that with most of macro today, is a measurement problem.
I thought you were also going to say that governments have an interest because the government needs to support itself, and it's very hard to support itself by tapping the informal economy.
That's
Which provides an incentive to expand the informal economy, as Italy the classic case. But there's larger questions here about what do we really know about how an economy works, and where's the boundary between the one and the other. I was just thinking as you were talking, you can walk around the lake for exercise, or you can go to the gym and pay a fee to exercise. What's the difference from a overall societal benefit of doing things one way or another, and what's the relationship between the GDP measures and societal welfare? Pretty. Those are larger questions than what you're dealing with.
The other question is, we're talking about sort of the shadow economy at the lower level, but there's a higher level shadow economy in terms of sort of the services that people provide to each other. An entrepreneur, for example, can get a lot of free service. They don't pay for all the services that they get because of friendships and things like that. And that's not what we're talking about here. But I mean, there is a shadow economy in higher level services as well.
There's one other thing that you don't get at, but I read a lot about and worry about, and that is the nature and extent of rent seeking and rent capture in different industries in which cash is paid but no value is returned for what is, simplest example is somebody getting mugged. You take your wallet, you don't get anything in return. But then you go down the line to all the other industries that are able to capture rents for one reason or another. And then when I watch something like this, that goes into GDP, but there's a difference between the number that goes into the GDP and the benefits that return to society in exchange for the rent capture.
Yes.
I never read much about that, although there was a nice piece in The Economist a couple of months ago that tried to get at that in a very interesting way.
Well, Mario, I think you can see.
Time to quit, I suppose.
You really, you stimulated a lot of
That's
thought
good to
here.
hear always, yeah.
Terrific presentation.
Thanks a
Thank
lot.
you very much indeed. And Cosette had to leave, but she's going to be speaking in 2 weeks on adjudication in the World Trade Organization.
Oh,
And
good.
that's a completely different
Same
subject.
time, same station?
Pardon me?
Same time, same station?
Same time, same station, 2 weeks' time. So
Okay.
good to see you here. Thank you.
Nature, I had a question on nature.
Yes.
How do we value nature? Is it part of the
Oh,
science?
yeah.
Well, I think it's related to what was said before. It's like, if you just go at GDP as a measure, it's just the value of the things that are traded in the market. And there has been this big debate on whether we should expand that definition to include nature, to include happiness. Right now, I'm just using the good old version, stuff that gets transacted in the market. Then again, if you give me a measure that includes nature, I'm going to be happy to run it.
Okay, thank you.
Are we the ignorant person here?
No, we're all
Not
ignorant here.
understanding all the
Yeah.
math or the economic. We need a question enterprises. We don't have a story to tell the drastic changes in the shadow economy and falling on. Can you even template or a drastic to find out?
Yes, yes. Right now, because then, what we are, so there is this line of thought in economics that says, we have a bunch of models, which supposedly are useful. So what happens if we take them seriously and say, okay, these are the restrictions that are applied in the model, these are the equilibrium conditions that must hold.
Okay.
So if those things are really true, and again, what's the alternative? There is no equilibrium, there is nothing, so it's just random. Then we should observe these things. So
Does it hold though?
does it hold? That was the alternative.
Well, but see, that's the way it iterates. I mean, you first take it seriously, then you might discover problems, then you go back and, right? it's
So for example, the graph that you would believe this for Japan, basically. You would think that Japan is a very civilized economy. It's basically going down.